One of the paradoxes about British abstraction of this period is that so much of it comes out of a very particular place, St Ives in Cornwall. It's a small fishing village right on the edge of the Atlantic, quite remote and difficult to get to. There's a railway line that goes down, but it's very slow. And it's a long way from London, from the apparent centres of the art world. One of the things that was said about St Ives too was because it was surrounded on three sides by sea in places, that there was this extraordinary reflective light which the painters valued. So there is a relationship between that environment and the abstraction of so much of British art of the 1950s, and you see it too in Patrick Heron. He's not shy about saying, I am influenced by the world around me, I do look at it very carefully, and it works its way into my paintings. Abstract Expressionism is most associated with New York, the high-rise business and finance capital of the post-war world. But oddly, it also had an outpost in St Ives. They were linked by abstraction, landscape, and a sense of the sublime. And their relations tell us something about how the artists of an old, fading empire responded to the order of the new. When the British painters first came across abstract expressionism, they found it very liberating in many ways. Whereas the pre-war abstraction, of which the British were most familiar in the work of Ben Nicholson, for instance, with his reliefs, or Nam Garbo with his constructivist sculptures, were quite cold, rational, geometric works. Abstract expressionism opened up this new path in which you could have abstraction, but at the same time have emotion, spontaneity, feeling, and gesture. And this was very important to many British painters of the 1950s, including Heron.
I think the important thing for me is that, the artists of St Ives, like Patrick Heron, Peter Lanyon, the moment of formation, in a way, didn't have a sense of abstract expressionism. I think they're part of a broader phenomenon of artists in the wake of the Second World War. They're the generation who had fought in the war or been conscientious objectors, kind of remaking an idea of a modern way of painting. And I think it's important for St Ives that they had there some of the kind of eyewitnesses of pre-war modernism in Nam Garbo and Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth. So that kind of utopian idealism of the abstract movement in the 30s and international abstraction was the kind of root of something, a rethinking of what modernism could be in the wake of the war and the Holocaust and the bomb. And I think particularly the ancient landscape offers something that is, more secure.
This painting is called Yellow Painting with Orange, Brown, Ochre Squares, which sounds like a boring title, but it actually tells you quite a lot because it tells you what Heron is really interested in here. In other words, he's interested in experimentations with colour. Heron has thought very carefully about the placement of these squares, and there's quite a lot of variation and incident in that. Also, in the handling of the paint, which is still very deliberate, it's done with a brush, the trace of a gesture and a movement, quite deliberate, and there's a lot of variation in that too. There is a lot more formal incident in a painting like this, and a lot more composition than there is in much abstract expressionist work. Heron says himself, composition, that's an old word, and it's one that we want to hang on to.
Heron is slightly separate, I think, from some of the other artists around him because he's such a formalist. He's not a great avant-gardist. He's a great believer in a kind of modern tradition.
I mean, one of the things that he hangs on to, in a way, again, is a sense of composition, which is, sometimes for the Americans condemned as a sort of European weakness or decadence or something, but it seems to be something that these artists want to hang on to.
He was very insistent that while his kind of criteria for value judgments were formal, he was nevertheless insistent that painting should have subject matter, that he was, one of his first published reviews is a sort of dismissal of a lot of Nicholson's work for being too purely abstract. And he insisted on a kind of modernist tradition from Cézanne's Apples through Picasso, Matisse, and so on, where subject matter rendered in kind of formalist terms was the key thing.
When Heron starts to think about the development of abstract expressionism, he says some very interesting things about it. He says they achieve their great scale, their freedom, their flatness. But where do they go from here? And what he sees is that they can't develop formally. There seems to be nothing else for them to do but to repeat the same performance over and over again. Well, Heron can't handle that. He wants to carry on experimenting with space, with colour, and with composition. He's very attached to the autonomy of the painting, and we should see this work behind me, Ochre Skies, as being primarily an experiment in formal abstraction of colour, but also something which has some relationship to landscape and the environment, and particularly perhaps to the idea of seeing sun over water. St Ives is known for its extraordinary sunsets. You get these amazing bands of colour in the sky. There's a certain embrace of a little chance and automatism here too, which does tie it to abstract expressionism in the drips and the splatters across the canvas. And he doesn't mind that, he leaves it, he doesn't correct it. So this is, in some ways, a compromise between a fully autonomous gestural painting and something which is marked and considered and composed.
He's found a way of maintaining all the values that he cares about, which is subject matter, colour and space, and something, he's a great believer in intuition, I think. One of the things that he comes back to again and again is this idea of the importance of light, the Cornish light, this unique quality of light in West Cornwall because it's surrounded by the sea, from which a certain kind of painting comes.
This painting by Peter Lanyon borrows quite a lot from abstract expressionism. It is quite difficult to read, and it's highly expressionist. There's a great deal of a different kind of mark-making in this picture, scumbling and swooping gestures and drips and different paint thicknesses and a lot of play with surface. These gestures are expressive. They seem to suggest something about Lanyon's inner psyche and his emotional state at the time that he did the work. Yet at the same time, this painting is very different from abstract expressionism. Lanyon was a glider. This was one of his passions in life. So he starts to see the landscape, the Cornish landscape, in a very different way from most other painters. The title of this painting, Thermal, is no mistake. It's to do with the spiralling columns of hotter air that bring the glider up into the skies. And you can see some of that spiraling going on in the painting itself. These marks here are certainly the traces in paint of an expressive gesture. You can feel it here and here and here, but they're also somehow representations or at least allusions to the movement of a glider in the air as it circles up and up in a thermal.
The roots of thermal, in Lanyon's own development, if you take it back to the beginning of the 50s and trace it through, he's an artist who's trained with Ben Nicholson and Nam Gabo, has taken on that kind of the idealism of constructivism, but realizes, I think, or feels a need to have it rooted. And so he starts making paintings that are about places, not just landscape, but initially a lot of it is about the movement, physical movement through a place. Then at the end of the 50s, he starts gliding. And that's where thermal comes from. It's very much a kind of expression in his mind, I think, of a sort of phenomenological experience of being in space, but also, I think, as that suggests, being kind of in the world.
The colours in this painting and the variations in tone could all be read as having some bearing on the natural environment, on clouds, on the colour of the sea seen from a great height, of sky, and of land seen from a distance or through veils of mist. And in this way, this painting is representational, or at least it has a relation to representation of nature, and indeed of representation of the nature of a particular place of the Cornish landscape. In this sense, it's really quite different from most abstract expressionism. The things that Lanyon takes from abstract expressionism and turns towards his own very particular art are to do with the freedom of gesture, the lack of worry about the level of abstraction, and the very scale of this painting. It's quite large. It's not as large as some of the massive pieces of abstract expressionism, but in terms of British painting at the time, it is quite big, and we have a very different bodily relationship to it in the gallery as a result.
The way he talks about himself to his friends is, he has this sort of tortured splashing in the studio, trying to get the image out that he wants to get. I mean, Thermal, I think, is one of the most fluent paintings of his, whereas often, the strength and weakness of the paintings is their sense of a kind of tortured awkwardness. I think Heron, in the 60s, almost overstates his receptiveness to abstract expressionism. We welcome, this new contribution to a kind of international phenomenon, and we admire your ambition and scale and the extremity to which you've taken, this language of shallow space. But I wouldn't go any further. Basically, he says, that's enough now. I think now what we need is consolidation, not more revolution.